Hi, this is Dr. Jabali, and in this video, we're going to focus on section 5.2, which is about natural selection. Here are some of the things that we will focus on. We will discuss about natural selection, how it occurs if there is a variation among members of the same species. Again, very important, natural selection only happens if there is a variation of the same species. We're also going to talk about mutation, meiosis, and cell reproduction, how they are the ones that cause the variation. We're also going to talk about adaptations, how the traits makes that individual be able to survive in that environment. We're also going to talk about how species tend to produce more offspring than the environment can support. We are going to talk about the individuals that are very much adapted will survive and eventually produce more offsprings, while the ones who are not adapted, they will die and less offsprings of themselves. We are going to talk about individuals can produce and pass on the traits to their offsprings. We're going to say the natural selection increases the frequency of characteristics that make individuals adapt, right? While decreases the frequency of those traits that cannot stand and eventually die. We're going to see the changes of the finches of Daphne Major, as well as the evolution of antibiotic resistance in bacteria. So now we talk about these. Now let's go ahead and talk about this section. We have here 4 examples of natural selections. We have variation. And when we say variation, we're basically talking about within that same species, right? You can see there's a yellow and a brown butterflies, right? So it's a genetic variation, and it says the word here within, which is very important that you understand the word is within that population. It's not 2 different populations. It's within the population there is variation. And of course, it still has to be inherited, it's passed on. The second one is competition. Of course, when you produce so much offsprings, it can lead to basically competition going on who's going to eat more. So let's say if you have 10 kids and there's only one hamburger, those 10 kids are going to be fighting for that hamburger. That's what the competition is about. We also have adaptations, in which basically the one who has the best trait, right, with the best adaptation will be the one that survive. But it's not just about surviving. It's also being be able to pass on their gene to the next generation. So remember, if you can survive the environment, but yet you cannot pass on your gene, then that's not part at all of the evolution or the natural selection. And the last, of course, it is the selection. Selection basically just means that over many generations, there will be a change in allele frequency. That means one frequency is dominant over the other. That frequency is the one that survives. And if that frequency is the one that survives, he's the one who's going to be passed on to the next generation. And with evolution, which means with a long time of accumulating this, you will see that the entire population only has that one specific allele. So these are the 4 ways in which natural selection is happening. Very important to understand that these are natural. These are not manipulated at all. So looking at that, let's talk about selective pressure. Selective pressure means it's the environmental factor. What that means, it's coming from the environment, and it means that it's somehow kind of reducing any chances of a population surviving, and reproducing and surviving whatever the environment is coming to. So eventually, if you are killing one type of population and only accepting one type of population, evolution will happen. That means there will be extinction of one type of species, while one will be surviving. Now, what are examples of selective pressure? It can be competition, predation, disease, parasitism, land clearance, climate change, or pollutants. All of these can change the surrounding. Now, a very well-known example of selective pressure that has been taught in so many years in high school is that the long legs and the long neck of the giraffe. What is that about? Basically, that is just showing, let me show you a picture drawing here, maybe I have more space here. You just think about if the trees were so big, right? And of course, I suck in drawing here, so I'm just going to put a giraffe like this. And you have this giraffe, or you have this other giraffe here, which is way more bigger, right? So which one will survive? Obviously, this one with the long neck and legs, right, will probably be able to eat, while this one is not. So what happens? This guy, because of selective pressure, in this case, the selective pressure is the height of the tree. The small giraffes will die, and in the end, this one will pass on. So now all the giraffes are tall. That was what we meant by selective pressure. So it all starts, for example, you have here as an example microbes, right? They all are white little circles, and then with time, or say months, now you have, of course, sometimes mutations happen naturally in the environment. So you have two new mutations, but you still have the white as dominance, right? And then they continue to grow and develop and creating more of their babies. So you have a couple more mutations moving on, but then bam, suddenly you have a selective pressure. And that selective pressure can be an antibiotic that kills all these microbes. However, when it kills all these microbes, there's one of them that is able to resist the antibiotic. That means it's able to resist the medicine. So as you can see here, all of them died, right? The white, the blue, the yellow, they all died. But there's one of these microbes that survived. It was the red. The red had somehow a mutation, and that mutation made them stronger to survive this whatever antibiotic, right? So now, since they survived, they need one more thing. They should be able to reproduce and pass on their genes to the next generation. And this way, now look, the population became a new population of just the red microbes. So you can see in the beginning it was just white, but because of the selective pressure, now we have all red. That's what we're talking about in evolution using selective pressure. So besides the selective pressure, we can talk about population, how it tends to produce more offspring than the environment can support. This is another way of killing one type of population and another population surviving. Now, when you have too much babies, right? When you have so many babies, what can you do when you have so much babies but not enough support? That means not enough food or land, so you start to struggle to survival. How do they struggle? For example, competition of food, right? Trying to find, catch, open, or digest. Predation. Since they're fighting with each other, or they're trying to avoid or escape each other, or catching each other, there's going to be more fight. Another way of survival is parasitism. In the shortage of food, there will be death and so much diseases, and so some parasites will start to invade, attack, and some of them will tolerate. Again, diseases will come into the directions, competition of space, where do we live, where do we survive, where do we produce, all these stuff. And of course, there is a competition for mates. Who are we going to attract? We're fighting each other to get the girl. Who's going to be able to fertilize? Who are we providing for? So all these examples of struggle for survival. So here is an example. Let's just say we have a population. And in this population, we have 100 people. And in this 100 people, we have about 500 amount of food, and let's say we have 1,000 space. In this kind of scenario, it's a perfect scenario, right? Enough food, enough space, all great. However, as the years and the decades go by, now we got 1 million people. That means we have produced so many offsprings. When we do this, what has happened to the food? Now the food, there's only 20 food, and when it comes to space, we have 0 space. Why? Because look, it's 1,000. We only have 1 million people. So now we're fighting from the same spot. Now, because of that, there's a shortage, right? Now, since there's a shortage, what's going to happen? There's going to be a struggle to survive. So when there's a struggle to survive, right? What's the first thing we're going to do? The first thing is the strongest will survive. Sure, but the strongest will survive. And what I mean by the strongest will survive, the one who has the best what? Trait. The best one that can best adapt to the situation, right? So in this case, it'd be somebody that is very strong or somebody that is very rich. Now, in the middle of this process, besides saying that the one that has the best to adapt, he also needs to be able to reproduce. Because what's the point of you having the best trait and you survive, but then you cannot reproduce and pass your trait to the child? Beside that, there's going to be other things. There's going to be competition for the food. There's also going to be competition for places. Now with that, that's going to lead to death. And with death, there might lead to diseases going on. So all of these will end up causing an evolution because in the end, who's going to survive? Only the one who has the best rate who can actually reproduce. The rest will die from diseases, from death, for even starvation or competitions, right? Some are going to start killing each other, right? They'll be killing in order to see who's going to get who. So this is an example when there's an overproduction of offsprings in the area, when there is more of people and less of the material, which leads to this Malthusian dilemma. You can see the blue line as the resources. However, the population here is in pink. So in the row here, you can see that it's okay, it's totally fine. And you can see the population is kind of slowly start to rise, but then it reaches that main point here, which is the Malthusian catastrophe. That's where we have matched the population size with the resources. After that, you can see that the population start to go way more than actually there is any resources. And this is where the crisis happens. This is where the resources cannot sustain the entire population. So that means there will be fights. It goes back to this whole process here. There will be competition for the food in places. There will be death. There will be diseases. There will be killing. And only the strong one will survive with the best rate who can adapt and, of course, who can reproduce and pass on to their child. So only of the survival of the fittest, the best trait, the beneficial one, will survive and the rest will die. And even if you survive, you still have to be able to pass on your genes to your offspring to continue that natural selection going on. Now, there is 3 main mechanisms by which genetic variation can happen between individuals of the species may occur. That means within the population, there is variations. That means, for example, within the human population, we have variations, right? Red hair, blonde, brunette, all of these are variations within the population. For that to occur, we have 3 things: mutation, meiosis, and sexual reproductions. These are 3 ways in which we can create a variation within, and I keep saying the word within because that's very important in the population. Mutations can happen anytime during DNA replication, transcription, translation, in which eventually you're going to have different types of gametes. That means different types of eggs and sperms coming out. Also, you have meiosis here, which meiosis leads to crossover, as well as independent assortment that happens in metaphase 1, right? So that means you're changing the genes, so you're changing the chromosomes and giving each gamete different genes. And then we have sexual reproduction, which is a combination between the sperms, right? So let's say the sperms with the eggs. You can have different sperms mixing with different eggs, and that will give you different gene combinations of the offspring, right? It's not always the same egg going with the same sperm. Men produce 1 million sperms per day, and trust me, those 1 million sperms, they're very different from each other. Same with the woman, they produce eggs. All their eggs are different from each other. All of this because of crossover. And then we don't know which egg is going to mix with which sperm. So there's so many possibilities. So these 3 together causes this genetic variation inside that one type of species. So when we talk about variation, what it results? It results in random mutations, like I said, DNA replication, variant factions. And when it comes to sexual reproductions, we have meiosis and random fertilization. The random fertilization is basically just saying, hey, are we doing which sperm with which egg? And meiosis, we have the crossover and the random assortment. So this is basically showing a map of what I was talking about, how we can cause the variation in species. Now, is it good to have variation? Yes, because when we have more variation, if a catastrophe comes in, if a selective pressure comes in, then we have more chances of surviving. Imagine if we have just one type of variation, and then it comes a certain disease and kills them all, then we're done. But if we have, let's say, 5 variations, and there's one of them survive, that's good. One of them will survive the disease, the other 4 will die. But still, because there was a variation, there was more chances of survival. So here we have a variation of population, right? And the variation has to be inherited. That means you must be able to pass it on. So in the middle of this process, right? Let's say the population is producing more offspring than the environment can support, or there's some kind of environmental change, like you give them a medicine, or there's a disease, whatever it is. So that means any of these 2 cases, they will start to struggle to survive. Agree? So once again, let me just here take the highlight. So there's 2 things. Here you can possibly have overproduction or something in the environment changes. Any of these 2 will cause some kind of struggle survival. So now they hit. Now, any variation that is weak, that means that they cannot stand it, will die. And they're less likely to produce and to pass on their genes, so the frequency of that gene is decreased. That means you're not going to see much of them anymore. On the other side, if you have a trait or a variation that is very strong, you will survive, and with that you will pass the gene to the next generation. And now what happens? You have a gene frequency. That means you have more of that trait in the population, and that means you have a new population which is adapted to this new environment that you have created, and it will only have the traits of this variation that was strong. So this is good sometimes to have variation in the population. So let me give you an example of this variation. Here we have 3 types of bacteria: bacteria 1, 2, and 3, right? Those are 3 variations of bacteria. Now suddenly you put an antibiotic in there. Antibiotic, it's a medicine that kills bacteria. In this process, you end up killing number 2 and number 3. Why? Because they couldn't resist the medicine, the antibiotic. However, number 1 here did survive. And when he survived, he was able to reproduce and do what? Pass on his genes to the next generation. So now, what happened to the population of 2 and 3? It ceased to exist. It's gone. It's finished. Capiche. Done. Finished. And the population 1 is now the new population. It's a population just made of number 1. That's called evolution. Here, what was the selective pressure? Of course, the selective pressure was the antibiotic. You threw a medicine to them, and even though there was 3 variation, only 1 survived from that medicine. So when we talk about antibiotic resistance with bacteria, that's one of the big examples that comes in IB. Talk about how one bacteria is resisting to the antibiotic. Another one of these natural selections that happens is, of course, when it comes to adaptive radiation, which I mentioned in the section of the video 5.1, where basically you had a bird in one island, and then there's some hurricane, tornado, whatever it is, pushed some birds to move to different islands, as you can see. And then in different islands, they had different types of food, and these different varieties of foods were the selective pressure. That means this food allowed them to change their beaks. These foods cause these beaks, these foods, and so forth. So the selective pressure, one more time here, it was the food of the different islands that caused them to change their beaks. So you can see that they have changed just because of the surrounding, and they have adapted. So now from one tiny little bird here, now we have different species of birds because they had to adapt to the new environment. So here are the most important components when it comes to the process of natural selection, which means it's happening naturally. The environment is choosing the best trait. Inherent variation. There must be variation within the population. Otherwise, it kills all one. Imagine if there was just one bacteria and that bacteria dies with the antibiotics. That's it. Bacteria cease to exist. So it's important that we have different variation. Competition will result in the overproduction of offspring. That's another thing. If we are producing more offspring than we can give them food, the competition will happen. Also, environmental pressure leads to differentiated reproduction. That means, again, if an environmental pressure hits, only the one with the best trait will survive, and that's the only kind of reproduction that will happen. Adaptation. Obviously, the one who has the best trait will benefit, will survive, and will be chosen to be the one to pass on the genes to the next generation. The genotype frequency will change across generations. Of course, the one with the best trait will pass his gene down, and that means you'll have a new frequency of genes. And of course, evolution occurs within the population. So a mnemonic for this coming from BioNinja is ICE. You need to have all these in order to get to the evolution. So once again, just very quickly going through this process, because remember, if they talk about natural selection, if you have to write an essay, you have to mention about the variation within, very important to population. Talk about how competition happens with the overproduction. Talk about the selective pressures that comes from the environment. Talk about adaptation with having the best trait. Talk about passing those genes, and eventually a new gene frequency will happen and eventually leads to the evolution within that population. This is examples of natural selection. And if you target these guys in that one essay, talking about each one of these, you definitely nailed the question. So here are basically the study guides for this 5.2. You can see that I answer all these questions in the video. You can go always back and try to answer them. If you know them well, then you have nailed 5.2. Making sure you also read these questions. And you can find also study guide PDF just on these questions again. Thank you very much.